Good afternoon. I warmly welcome all of you to the fourth webinar of the webinar series we have organized to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the National Institute of Fundamental Studies. Today is a very remarkable day for us because our guest speaker is the founding director of the NIFS. So I would like to invite the co-chair of the 40th anniversary celebrations committee, Professor Deepal, to introduce the speaker today.
Thank you, Dr. Shalini. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to Prof Chandra Wikramasinghe and those who are joining from the Europe and USA. Of course, Prof Chandra Wikramasinghe needs no introduction. He's one of the most famous scientists Sri Lanka has produced. Of course, he has published dozens of books. When I was a schoolboy, I used to read some of his books with great interest. Prof Chandra Wikramasinghe is a world-renowned astronomer, astrophysicist, and a pioneer of astrobiology. In 1977, Prof Wikramasinghe and late Sir Fred Hoyle became very famous for their panspermia hypothesis. Actually, the proposed theory that comets carry the seeds of life and the life is distributed throughout the universe. They propose a theory. Actually, personally, I also believe that the life is universal, not just confined to our Earth. This theory, known as cometary panspermia, is supported by discoveries in astronomy, geology, and astrophysics. Prof Chandra Wikramasinghe was a former fellow of Jesus College of Cambridge and a founder member of the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge. For us at IFS, he's a very special person as he was the founder director of the Institute of Fundamental Studies in Sri Lanka. From 1973 to 2010, he was a professor at Cardiff University, UK. He is now an honorary professor at several universities worldwide, and he continues to publish books and research papers in astrobiology. Here, as the co-chair of the 40th anniversary committee, I have the honor of presenting Professor Chandra Wikramasinghe's talk as a part of the 40th anniversary celebrations of the NIFS. The title of the talk is Our Place in the Cosmos, the Role of Culture and Colonization. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank the director of NIFS for inviting me to talk at this conference. I am particularly happy to have the opportunity to address the young scientists of this country, my own native country to which I owe so much. It is your generation, the younger generation, that bears the heavy burden of seeing science move in the right direction, away from unsupported dogmas, of which there are so many today, to hard, irrefutable facts. I hope my talk today would give you some inkling of my own struggle to move in this direction, to move in the direction of objective reality, objective truth, and away from dogma. Ideas relating to our place in the cosmos form the cornerstone of all ancient philosophies and later of all religions, extending from prehistoric to modern times. From thousands of years ago, humans, Homo sapiens, our species, instinctively felt a deep and inextricable connection with the cosmos. And we feel that today, every single day, when we look at this beautiful spectacle of the night sky, we have the same feeling of a connection with the cosmos. I grew up with this kind of spectacle of the Milky Way showing so clearly night after night in the skies of Sri Lanka, particularly when I went into the hill country on my holidays. The skies were absolutely pristine and unpolluted, just as you see it on this slide today. Here you see the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon, the myriads of stars, the millions of stars, interspersed with dark clouds, dust clouds, of which I was going to, in later life, research and discuss a lot about these dark clouds. So this is what I experienced, and it made a very deep impression on me from very early years in my life. And so such a connection is what I expressed in the form of this haiku poem, which I think I wrote, composed when I was maybe barely 15 or 16. And this is what I wrote. Among a myriad stars, I stand alone and wonder how much life and love there was tonight. Early humans often express the same sense of connection with the deep cosmos, with the universe at large, in the form of art, as for instance in this cave painting. And this is a painting from a cave in France, the Lascaux caves, dated at 15,000 years before the Common Era. That's about 17,000 years ago. The picture on the left is what the cave painting looks like. It shows stars, dots, those black dots are stars. And on the right is a representation of these objects that are depicted in the painting, comparing them with the night sky, with the star map. And you see mapping of Orion's belt, you see the constellations of Pleiades and Taurus and so on. And the Taurus is important because I think in those days when there was no agriculture, that people hadn't discovered how to plant crops and to domesticate animals, they hunted wild animals. And the wild bull was probably one of the hunted animals that were needed for them to survive and give them food. With the advent of agriculture, with the birth of animal husbandry, with the discovery that you can actually grow crops, sow seeds and grow plants and eat the produce from them, led to the development of cities, the birth of the first cities, and the growth of civilizations. Along with these developments of purely sort of subsistence developments, a great diversity of ideologies, of thinking, of different models of the world developed. And these things developed in at least two separate, or four, I think, four major foci that I have put on this map: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilization, and China. So four separate major foci of ideologies that developed with early civilization. Two of these cities are very important. The city of Ur, which is on the left-hand side. This is the remains of the city of Ur, very well preserved. Archaeological remains still exist here in Babylonian city of Ur, dated at 3,500 BC. And on the right-hand side is the Harappan Indus Valley civilization. Again, a very sophisticated civilization that existed maybe a couple of thousand years before the Babylonian civilization at 5,000 BC. So these two centers of early civilization have served as a dominant influence from which everything essentially spread throughout the world in later centuries. The commingling and intermingling of ideas and ideologies have taken place across the centuries and the millennia, crossing these vast areas on the earth. Sometimes the intermingling was deliberate. Sometimes people decided to meet, travel, get together and discuss ideas. Other times the mixing of ideas happens by accident. One interesting idea that we normally attribute to Western Europe is the early ideas of atomism. But the seeds of early atomic theory is firmly placed not in the West, but in ancient Vedic philosophy in India. The concept of atoms and the earliest recorded ideas, the written recorded ideas of atomism, are to be found in the works of the Vedic scholar named Aruni, who lived in the 8th century before Christ. Aruni wrote, and I quote, "Particles too small to be seen, massed together into all the substances and objects of experience. These are known as kana." It is also well recorded and well accepted now that schools of atomism, several independent schools of atomism, developed in India, in the Indian subcontinent, as early as the 7th century before the Common Era. And there was more that came from India. In ancient India, from about 2000 BC to 500 BC, Vedic, Jain, and Buddhist cosmologies first introduced astoundingly long timescales into our thinking. More than years, more than centuries, more than millennia. Then also mathematical concepts of infinity and zero firmly belong to India. They originate in ancient India, and they originate in Vedic, Jain, and Buddhist writings. Depictions of these concepts are often in symbols, but they represent ideas that we recognize today, modern ideas, and ideas that have a crucial relevance for modern science. So certainly not everything that is important started in the West, and certainly the numbers, the Hindu Arabic numbers 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, minus 1, minus 2, and so on, all that started in India. The beginnings of dialectics, the theory or the idea of dialectics, the idea that dialogue and discussion is valuable in reaching scientific truths, essentially the scientific method, also, I believe, belongs to Buddhism. This is a quotation from the Parinibbana Sutra that was supposedly the last words, among the last words, that the Buddha uttered and spoke to his chief disciple, Ananda. He said in the sutra, "You should live as lamps unto yourselves. Hold fast to the lamp of truth. Take refuge only in truth. Look not to refuge to anyone beside yourself." Now, what fantastic advice is that? I mean, that's an advice that I would give to any research student starting a career in scientific research. Over some 5,000 years or more, ideas from two main centers of civilization intermingled, competed, sometimes clashed. And these centers are the Babylonian center that I showed you, the city of Ur was the center of that, and the Harappan civilization in India between the 3rd and 5th millennium before the Common Era. So on the left-hand side, you have the Babylonian traditions percolating through into classical Greece, to the 5th century Greece of Socrates, Plato, and so on, through to the Roman Empire, to the birth of Christendom, and finally to Western Europe in the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and in the Enlightenment in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Then on the right-hand side, you have the Indian traditions, and I referred already to the Indian number system, to the infinities firmly belonging to India, and these ideas then percolated through to Arab culture, and then reluctantly sometimes resisted violently, reached Western Europe. So these are the two main trajectories. So civilizational flow of ideas took place over thousands of years before the Common Era. And these two paths that I've shown are the main areas of flow of ideas, from India to indigenous colonial to culture, sciences, that were often very strongly resisted when it reached the West, and the Mesopotamian ideas that came from Babylonia to ancient Greece, and then finally to Europe. After the rise of the British East India Company in the 17th century, ideas that originated in India were generally regarded as being inferior, rejected in favor of ideas that originated in ancient Greece. So Greece, classical Greece of the 5th century, is thought of in terms of all our modern Western thinking as essentially the starting point of the great ideas that shaped philosophy and science. This is not true at all. The British Empire, which has a lot to answer for in terms of our own history, shown here in red, is what the British Empire was around the middle of the 19th century. About a fifth of the populated world was essentially colonized by Britain, along with the military colonization, with the colonization in terms of administration. There was also a subtle scientific colonization. Indigenous ideas of India were rejected generally. Ayurvedic medicine was rejected. The number system was initially very vigorously rejected before it was finally accepted. The Hindu number, the normal number system. And this scientific colonization in various ways persisted after the empire ended in the middle of the 20th century. Sri Lanka was independent in 1948, India a year earlier. So by the middle of the 20th century, the physical empire, the administrative British Empire, just disappeared like morning dew, vanished like morning dew. But ideas that were scientific ideas, philosophical ideas, that had a Greco-Roman tradition seem to be locked into our thinking, even to the present day. Greco-Roman traditions first took shape in ancient Athens. The grand, glorious period of Athens was in the 5th century BC. You have all the great schools of philosophy, the academies, Socrates, Plato, and so on. So 5th century BC Athens was really a great time to be in Athens. And a lot of things happened there, but as I said, a lot of the Athenian ideas or the Greco-Roman ideas had earlier precedents in either Babylonia or in India. The Greek philosopher Democritus, who lived 494 to 404 BC, was about 200 years after the Indian atomists. I talked about Aruni, who was the first recorded descriptions of an early theory of atomism in India. But this was independently developed. We think independently. We think there was no communication between Democritus and the ancient Indians, but they may well have been, we don't know. So independently, it seems that Democritus developed an atomic theory in which he said the universe was infinite and eternal and composed of two components, two elements, atoms and the void. Exactly the same as what the Indians said 200 years earlier. All matter and all living creatures were made of these two elements. Then the other person, that other philosopher that is very crucial to what I'm going to continue in my talk today is the Greek philosopher Anaxagoras, who lived around 5th century BC also. He belonged to the same pre-Socratic school of Democritus, and he proposed that living seeds, which he called spermata, were distributed throughout the cosmos. So pans meaning everywhere, spermata seeds, and so this, the word that we use now, panspermia, was essentially, to some extent, coined by Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was a very independent thinker. He challenged many other aspects of Athenian orthodoxy. For instance, the Athenian view, the classical Greek view, that the sun and the stars and celestial bodies were gods and goddesses. He challenged this. He said they were not gods and goddesses, that the sun was a red hot stone, the moon was a lump of earth, and for this he was banished from Athens. 2 centuries after Anaxagoras, these views still remained very much in the fore and very, very prevalent in ancient Greece. We have, for instance, the writer, philosopher Metrodorus of Chios, who wrote as follows about life in the universe, life in the cosmos. And I quote, he says, "It is unnatural in a large field to have only one shaft of wheat, and in the infinite universe only to have one living world." How close can that be to what I'm going to tell you later on today? But this consistency with Anaxagoras, with the correct panspermic view, did not last for long. Disaster strikes with the arrival of the great philosopher Aristotle, and this was the end of the story as far as panspermia is concerned, and a lot of things followed from that. Aristotle came to dominate Greek philosophy with his enormous corpus of work, which spanned science, theology, politics, art, metaphysics, literature, and so on. He wrote about almost everything that you can think of. So he was a truly great philosopher. And most of Aristotle's writings survived to almost to the present day, whereas only fragments of Anaxagoras, fragments of the writings of Democritus and Metrodorus have survived. And the reason for that is that and I'll come to that later, the ideas of these other guys, Anaxagoras, Democritus, and Metrodorus, was really strongly against Christianity, and a lot of the books were burnt during the Christianization of Rome. So coming back to Aristotle, it was Aristotle who, I think, essentially turned the tide for panspermia, turned the tide away from panspermia. His philosophy opposed and contradicted panspermia and contradicted the ideas of Anaxagoras and Metrodorus. Aristotle's mistakes essentially rang through the centuries and in many ways held back the progress of science, not just in panspermia, but in lots of other things as well. Anaxagoras, apart from saying that life arises continuously from non-living matter by a process of spontaneous generation, he also said that the Earth was the center of the universe. And he placed the Earth at the center, the stars and planets revolving around the Earth. So an Earth-centered universe was what Anaxagoras postulated. Dismantling the wrong ideas of Aristotle, disproving him, has essentially been a very, very difficult process and has defined the trajectory of Western science for nearly 2,000 years. The story really, starting around the 5th century BC with all the great philosophers, Anaxagoras, Socrates, and so on. The story really moves on from there. From the left, that's the Acropolis and modern remains of the Acropolis, and that's on the right-hand side is 12th century Rome. And what happened in Rome is that Constantine, Emperor Constantine, called Constantine the Great, becomes emperor in the year 306 of the Common Era, and he essentially forced the entire Roman Empire to be Christianized. So he spread Christianity throughout the classical world. Much of classical philosophy was destroyed. As I said, many of the books were burnt. And a Judeo-Christian worldview, a firmly Judeo-Christian worldview centered on the earth, began to take root. So this was, in terms of science, in terms of philosophy, it was a dreadful thing. There were two more disasters to follow. Christian theological support for the entire corpus of work of Aristotle, the Aristotelian philosophical corpus, grew from the time of a certain Saint Thomas of Aquinas in the 12th, 13th century of the Common Era. So this was during the time of the Pope and the Pope papacy and so on. And thereafter, after that 1200, this is coming into the dark ages of Europe. After that, the most important questions of science, of our existence, became linked to, not to experiment, not to observation, but to theology and religious culture. And then the Pope decided everything. Papal decrees ruled the classical world, the European world. This proof of Aristotle's Earth-centered cosmology, of course, began when people felt that this was totally wrong. There were lots and lots of astronomical observations that contradicted the theory that the Earth was at the center of the whole universe, center of the solar system. And so we have Galileo, Copernicus first in 1450s, then Galileo in the 1550s, Kepler, and finally Newton. Each of these individuals contributing facts, hard observational, astronomical, empirical facts that challenged Aristotle's Earth-centered cosmology. And finally, it was overthrown, but not without many casualties. On the way, Galileo was put under house arrest. He was imprisoned. And even through his imprisonment, he did with great work. He worked out how impacting bodies behaved, spheres impacting one, impacting the other, and so on. All this was worked out during Galileo's arrest, house arrest. This other guy, Giordano Bruno on the right, suffered a much more dreadful fate. He was condemned for saying that there were many planets with many life forms on these other planets and so on. And for saying that, he was essentially burned to death in the year 1600. So that's the kind of punishment that was endured by dissidents of the Orthodox point of view. And that doesn't go back now. We are in 2100, and at 1600 AD, Giordano Bruno was burnt to death. Overturning Aristotle's second proposition, Earth-centered life, has been very, very much harder. So you have Aristotle on the left there, the picture, a depiction of Aristotle, a picture of Aristotle, a sketch of Aristotle. In the middle is a picture of fireflies, Kala Madhuryo in Sinhala, twinkling in the night sky. And I put that picture because Aristotle stated that life emerges from non-life like fireflies emerging from a mixture of warm earth and morning dew. So he produced that, he referred to that as evidence for spontaneous generation. So fireflies from warm earth and morning dew. So life centered on the earth became really deeply intertwined, first with religion and later with an emerging colonial, Eurocentric scientific culture. And that is what I want to stress in the rest of my lecture. The great difficulty that we have in essentially overturning what is turning out to be a totally wrong worldview about life centered on the earth is because of a very long colonial oppression of ideas that were non-Eurocentric, that did not originate in the West. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century, experimental challenges to spontaneous generation of life, to the Aristotelian spontaneous generation of life were presented. There are many such experiments were done. Pasteur in 1870 showed through experiments, very cleverly constructed experiments, that microbes always derived from microbes that existed before. So life always came from pre-existing life, was Pasteur's conclusion. And the Lord Kelvin, the British physicist, seeing this discovery, referring to this discovery, discussed Pasteur's life from life dictum and made this statement: dead matter cannot become living without coming under the influence of matter previously alive. This seems to me as sure a teaching of science as the law of gravitation. So there were other people also, apart from Lord Kelvin. There was Helmholtz, the physicist Helmholtz, who made a similar statement. Then the chemist Arrhenius at the end of the 19th century. But all of these protestations did not have much effect, because the spontaneous generation idea was firmly locked into Western thinking, into Eurocentric, into European thinking. It survived, the spontaneous generation idea survived well into the 20th century, into the 21st century even. And I think we have to deal with that. In the modern version of the Aristotelian doctrine of spontaneous generation, this is a version that began to emerge in the early years of the 20th century. Organic molecules that are needed for life's origins were thought to come from ultraviolet light, from lightning, effects of lightning on clouds in the skies, producing organic molecules that rained into the oceans. The oceans become thick with organics that then combine spontaneously to form the first self-replicable living cells. And from that, all other life is subsequently supposed to evolve purely by Darwinian processes. Next comes chemist Stanley Miller and geologist Harold Urey, who in the mid-1950s showed that the Haldane-Oparin spontaneous generation may be right, could be right, because he showed that amino acids and organic molecules, simple organic molecules that are present in life, could be produced in a simulation from organic processes, inorganic processes such as electric sparks across mixtures, as shown in this experimental depiction on the right. This is Stanley Miller shown here on the right. And then but the organic molecules, I think, is a very, very far cry from life. And that is something that they did not recognize at the time. And this is something that Fred Hoyle and I really firmly impressed on the scientific community in the mid-70s and in the early 1980s. For the simplest bacteria, I mean, you can make the organic molecules, no problem. That's not a big deal. But from the organic molecules, say the amino acids, to make all the enzymes that are needed for living processes is an incredibly improbable process. So take the simplest microorganism, known microorganism, Mycoplasma genitalium. It has some 5,000 enzymes. And if you have a whole sea of amino acids, of the 20 amino acids that make proteins, to have the 500 specific amino acids assembled in a chain to form this long chain, the enzyme is exceedingly improbable. It is the same as 500 blindfolded people solving a scrambled Rubik cube. So you scramble the Rubik cube, and in one go, in one sort of twist, you ask these guys to recover the same colors on all the faces of the Rubik cube, and that's absolutely improbable. The improbability has been referred to in various ways, that it is like a tornado blowing through a junkyard, putting together a brand new working aircraft, a Boeing 747. So here is a picture of a tornado blowing through a junkyard containing all the plastics, all the screws, all the bits and pieces that could be put together to make a truly flying, working Boeing 747. And that is the probability or the improbability that we face. After 7 decades of high-tech laboratory work in laboratories right across the world, the kind of experiment that was done by Yuri Miller in the 1950s, by Poonam Perumal in the later decades of the mid-20th century, abiogenesis has been attempted in the laboratory, has proved a dismal failure, and remains, I think, an empty promise, because the probability hurdle to go from the components, the organic molecules, is not a big deal, the amino acids, and so on, the nucleotides, that's not a big deal to make from inorganic materials. But from that to get to the simplest life form, the arrangements, the very specific arrangements needed to get to a simple self-replicating life form is improbability is super astronomical. So the alternative then to a terrestrial origin in primordial soup against incredible and impossible odds is a return to the ancient concept of panspermia that I said originally belongs to the Vedic traditions, but then was taken on by Anaxagoras and Metrodorus in the 5th century BC, and then vindicated by the experiments of Pasteur in 1860s, but still rejected due to the force of conventional beliefs. So I began to re-examine this whole situation in 1975, when new astronomical data was coming in that was pointing in this direction. And that was where I began, along with my colleague Sir Fred Hoyle, to really try to come to grips with this problem. Is it possible that life is a truly astronomical phenomenon, as was proposed all these centuries ago by Anaxagoras, by the Vedic philosophers even earlier? The evidence was first examined in a long series of scientific papers published in Nature, and also in several books, a whole series of books, beginning with this book called Life Cloud, which we published in 1976. Arguing in these books, we argued through a long, sort of very, very rigorous set of arguments that comets must be the source of all life in the universe. Over the past 5 decades, from the time we first suggested these ideas and from the time we first published papers that pointed in this direction, support has arrived steadily from astronomy, from geology, as well as biology. Some of the first presentations and publications of our early discoveries were in fact made during my time here in Sri Lanka as the first director of the IFS. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's connected with your institute, very much connected with your institute. On the 27th of April, 1982, I delivered in the presence of His Excellency J.R. Jayawardena what was regarded as the inaugural lecture of the IFS. It was not the NIFS, it was the IFS. And the lecture was titled, Is Life an Astronomical Phenomenon? So this is published, this book, this is a published pamphlet. Later, months later, in December 1982, we had an inaugural conference, international conference. Fred Hoyle, my mentor, was the first speaker in this conference. And the several speakers after that talked about matters that related to life in the universe, life being a cosmic phenomenon. And as the first memoir of this Institute of Fundamental Studies, I don't think there have been later memoirs, as far as I'm to my best of my knowledge, in December 1982. This volume was published by Sir Fred Hall and myself, and this is an autographed copy of the front page of one of these copies, Proofs That Life is Cosmic. And recently, last year, World Scientific Publishing House has brought it out as a revised volume. Close to the time of the conference in 1983, we published this volume that contained all the papers that were discussed, all the papers that were presented at the meeting in Colombo as an inaugural conference. And there on the right-hand side is Fred Hall and me walking just outside the institute, buildings of the institute, IFS in the early, in Colombo. The IFS conference was also the first place where one very, very important piece of evidence for panspermia came to be expounded and explode, in fact. The German paleontologist Hans D. Flug was the first to discover really unequivocal evidence, unambiguous evidence for microbial fossils, for fossils of microorganisms inside of meteorites. He looked first at a meteorite called the Murchison meteorite, which fell in Murchison, Australia in the 1950s. And he took thin slices of this meteorite, put it on a sort of gauze, on a till, used hydrogen fluoride to essentially to melt out, to leach out all the mineral matrix. And what was left then is the organic structures, the sort of skeletons of bacteria and viruses, if there were any. And these were then examined under the microscope. And he found plenty of these. This is on the right-hand side is one structure called Pedomicrobium. On the right-hand side is a recent geological fossil of this meteor, of this microorganism. On the left-hand side are the bits they got, organic residues, the fossils, microfossils from the Murchison meteorite. And of course, we have more data of a similar kind from Murchison meteorite, from other meteorites, and in fact from the Polonnaruwa meteorite that's very much connected with island of Sri Lanka that fell into 2012 when a whole lot of investigators did a very similar analysis to Flug and found structures that were indigenous to the meteorite, indigenous to the stone, that could not have been contaminated. It came with the meteorite. So let me give now a very brief selection of the key developments in support of life's cosmic origins that moved on from that time, the 1980s, when I was in Sri Lanka, setting up giving the sort of essential start for your institute to the present day. Let me now give a very brief selection of the key developments that took place over the period from 1980s, after the IFS meeting that I talked about, to the present day. The first decisive evidence in favor of life everywhere in the cosmos came from astronomy. This picture here in the middle is a comparison between data points. The points are data from a telescope, and the telescope was the Anglo-Australian telescope used by my brother Dal in 1980 to look for the signature of bacteria, of freeze-dried, desiccated bacteria in the dust clouds of space. So this is the points, and the curve is a prediction that we had made. If the dust was largely bacteria, then we expected the astronomical observations to be like that. And when the astronomical observations were made available, it was amazing to find the astronomical observations dots sitting precisely on top of the predicted curve. And this was the first dramatic confirmation to us, in our minds, that we were on the right track. So the cosmic dust was certainly bacterial, and later we decided there also were viruses in comparable amounts. A similar set of data emerged after the last passage close to the sun of a very famous comet called Halleys Comet. And this was in 1986. Halleys Comet has a period of 86 years, and it returned in 1986 during the space age. And there was this image of the comet that was obtained from the Giotto spacecraft, the European spacecraft. They never expected the comet to be dark, and to be as dark as it is. It's supposed to be, it was described as being darker than coal. They expected it to be a bright snowfield, because that was the model of comets, dirty snowballs. And all of those ideas of comets, early ideas of comets, were completely disproved by observations of Halleys Comet. And Dahl and his colleague David Allen also made the first infrared spectrum of a comet using the telescope, the Anglo-Australian telescope. Again, these points are the observations, the astronomical observations. The curve is the predicted behavior of bacteria coming out in this huge flow out from the comet. And the comet, as I said, was found to be darker than its core, and that is a prediction that we made ahead of the encounter, the space encounter of the comet. Giotto was directing all his cameras with lenses almost close to nothing, to expecting a bright snowfield. And if you're going to photograph a bright snowfield in those days of simple cameras, you close the aperture, because if the aperture was too big, then you overexposed and didn't get any image. So what they found was that there was no image at all in their cameras, and they had to do a lot of image processing to get this image out eventually. And it was a massive surprise to find that comets were comprised of organic materials and were in fact darker than coal. So that's the 1986 situation. Fast forward 28 years, you have the Rosetta mission to a comet called 67P CG, and again, the same story. You have an organic comet, a dark comet with streams of organic materials spewing out. And this whole chart here is a comparison between the bacterial spectrum and the reflection spectrum reflectance behavior of the surface of the comet at different wavelengths. These are wavelengths in micrometers. So you have methane, organics flowing out, very complex organics, a very dark surface, and a surface reflectivity that matches bacteria and viruses. So that's where we stood. And in October of 2015, another important observation, a French group of radio astronomers now found that a comet called Comet Lovejoy was emitting a profuse flux of ethyl alcohol and a sugar, right? And this was again a surprise. And it's, of course, a fermentation product. Underneath the crust of this comet are bacteria that are essentially metabolizing and producing alcohol and the sugar. So that's where we stand, and the flow of stuff out of this comet was equivalent to 500 bottles of wine per second, clearly the products of fermentation. So everything is going fantastically for the cometary theory of life being everywhere. But then the question is, when and where did life start in the first instance? This is the big question, and the next question that has to be answered. And since life could not have started on the Earth, attention must be turned to bigger and bigger settings. So it's turned from the Earth, spontaneous generation just ignored, ruled out. Then we have these 100 billion comets around around our solar system. Could that be the source, the starting point of life? No, too small, too insignificant. Then you go to the entire Milky Way galaxy, and we have 100 billion stars with billions of comets surrounding them, possibly. And then we go to the local group of galaxies. So the galaxies don't come in singles, they come in groups, and they come in supergroups or superclusters. Even that is not big enough. We cannot have enough time, enough material to overcome the horrendous improbabilities that I already talked about. The comparison that I made of a tornado blowing through a junkyard, putting together a Boeing 747. So not even that large supercluster of galaxy with trillions upon trillions upon trillions of suitable locations could bridge the gap. So you go to the universe itself. And how did the universe start? The conventional story, which is by no means set in stone, is that the entire universe started 13.8 billion years ago in a conventional Big Bang model of the universe. And so if that happened, the most favorable location for life starting is not at the Big Bang itself, which is too hot and nothing is supposed to happen in terms of molecules or atoms even. So it's about 100 million years after that that you can even begin to see evidence of life. But all that has been thrown into serious doubt now, because there was a discovery of a satellite not many years ago, 2016, a satellite discovery of the furthest galaxy from our own galaxy, called GNZ11, which formed only 440 million years after the Big Bang. After the Big Bang, if it happened, if that was the beginning of the universe at 13.8 billion years ago. This is far too early for any stars to have formed, for any life to have formed even. So you have a sort of a competition between two alternatives. Roger Penrose and Neil Turok has, for many years, proposed that the universe undergoes these cycles, very much like the Vedic ideas of oscillating universes, that a universe that oscillates. Or the model of Fred Hoyle and Burbidge and Giant Nalika, again, a cyclic steady state universe in which there is no beginning or no end. So this is where we stand. Recently, Nobel laureate Sir Roger Penrose has questioned the standard Big Bang origin of the universe, and he has called his alternative model a conformal cyclic cosmology. Universe that undergoes an infinite number of cycles in which this Big Bang event. There is such an event where everything sort of all our material nearby has come from that explosion or expansion 13.8 billion years ago. That is true, but this is just one of a continuing cycle of which we are just one part. And this is also in accord with the quasi-steady state models of the universe that were proposed in the 1980s by my mentor, Sir Fred Hoyle, and my friend, Jayant Narlikar. And as I said, also very strikingly similar and in accord with ancient Vedic and Indian cosmologies. So whatever the precise nature of the universe origin might be, or cosmology might be, the beginning of life is a unique cosmological event. And of all its infinite attributes have all been generated in some single unique event. Everything that we can find that gets together, informational units that get together, genes, viruses, they were all there at the beginning. And panspermia and cometary panspermia is the route by which they are disseminated throughout all the prospective planetary homes, the route by which it certainly arrived on the Earth. And let's turn to the Earth now in our final part of the talk. In 2015, it was discovered that the very first evidence of microorganisms on the Earth is to be found inside tiny crystals of a mineral called zirconium. And these are found in rocks that condensed 4.1 billion years ago. And these are now exposed in a outcrop of rocks known as the Jack Hills outcrop in Western Australia. And this puts then the beginning of life, the earliest life on Earth, to a time when we know for sure that the Earth was severely bombarded by comets. It's a period of intense cometary bombardments. And during that period that you have in this Jack Hills region, that you find these little blobs of carbon, microscopic blobs of carbon, which are the relics of bacteria. We know they're the relics of bacteria because they have the light isotope of carbon selected against, compared to the heavy isotope. So that's where we stand. Life started there. And there's very little doubt that comets are the carriers of life, that the first impacting comets brought life to Earth 4.2 billion years ago. And so the next question is, what are the further implications? If comets did bring the first life to Earth, as in the Jack Hills outcrop shows us clearly, 4.2 million years ago, that process could not have stopped. It must still continue because this is a mesh of orbits of short period comets that are going around the Earth and the Sun, around the Sun particularly. And the red circle here is the orbit of the Earth, the path of the Earth. And you see that the Earth's orbit is in the midst of debris from comets. It's enmeshed in cometary orbits. So it will be very important and useful and exciting to look for evidence of microorganisms coming in from these comets. In collaboration with the Indian Space Research Organization, Fred Hoyle, Narlikar, myself, and a whole team of colleagues made the first attempts to collect infalling cometary material from the stratosphere, because as I told you, the Earth's orbit is just enmeshed in cometary orbits, and cometary orbits must contain the stuff that is being thrown out of comets, which have bacteria and viruses. And so it's important to try to pick these up before it gets mixed up with the Earth's environment, with terrestrial contaminants. So that's what we did on 20th of January, 2001. The collection involved evacuated, sterilized cylinders like what you have here, immersed in liquid neon, liquid nitrogen, and sent up on a balloon to 41 kilometers. Seals of these canisters, they're complete vacuum when it goes out, when it goes up, and it's open. Their valves are open, And when the valve is open, stratospheric air rushes in. And along with the stratospheric air, if there are aerosols, bacteria, they also get drawn into this. The valve is closed and the valve cylinder and parachute and contents are parachuted back for examination in the laboratory. So this is what was done. And what we found was that the air from 41 kilometers contained a huge amount of what we could identify as bacteria. And these could not have come from the ground. This is a clump of cocci and a bacillus, a rod bacterium here, and spherical bacteria, and a viable and non-culturable bacteria detected by some fluorescent dyes. From the sampling of this material, volume of the air we know, the density we know of the air, and the falling speed of particles we can estimate. We estimate that many tons of this material falls through every single day. It falls through the stratosphere. And that can translate, we can estimate that 20 to 200 million individual bacteria fall on the surface of the Earth every square meter. So there are 20 to 200 million bacteria per square meter per day. And such a flux of bacteria cannot go unnoticed. We cannot afford to ignore this, but for a long time, we've ignored it. Outside the windows of the International Space Station in 2018, this is a space station orbiting the Earth at 400 kilometers. This is the window of the space station. The astronomers, astronauts have found that microbes have been discovered on swabs that were taken from the outside of the space station 6 times in the course of the period to 2010 to 2016. So, and to 400 kilometers now, it's far too high for anything to be lofted from the ground. So there is no question, I think, that microbes are falling from space to the Earth. Bacteria and viruses have also been discovered almost at the same time, to 2018, at the top of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Spain. Is among the highest mountain range in Europe, and 10,000 feet. And again, this is the paper that's appeared recently. This is Sierra Nevada mountains, these are the mountaintops, and they had collecting devices placed there over a period of about 6 months. And what they found was hundreds of millions of viruses were falling from the skies per square meter. And tens of millions of bacteria were also falling in the same space. Viruses are the most efficient transmitters we know of genes between species on the Earth. And by extrapolation, they could also transmit and transfer information across the cosmos. Fred and I made this prediction way back in 1981. In our book, Evolution from Space, published in 1982, in fact, we said, and I quote, if viruses are incident from space, then evolution must also be driven from space. Viruses do not always attack the cells they enter. A viral particle may add itself placidly to one or other of the chromosomes. Viruses in our genes provide the potential for emergence of new life forms and for further evolution. So that's what we said way back in 1981. How could viruses, cosmic viruses, interact so intimately with evolving life forms on the Earth? This is a question that has to be answered. So either both evolved symbiotically on the Earth, and that's a huge question mark, or, in my view, much more likely, both evolved in an interconnected cosmic biosphere, a gigantic cosmic biosphere or microbiome. Viruses and evolution must then have a truly cosmic origin, and they must be intimately, inextricably be interlinked. Answers to questions like this have come from the new science of genome sequencing. And so there are no questions left as to the connection between viruses and evolution at the present time. In 2001, the human genome came to be fully sequenced. DNA of all our other present as well as fossil life forms were also completed. As far as the human genome is concerned, 5% of the entire human genome seems to be made up of relic virus sequences, ERVs and HERVs and so on as they're called. And if we look at the whole sequence of hominid evolution from monkeys to Homo sapiens, one end monkeys, one end Homo sapiens, we see that the relics of past pandemics are clearly present and clearly show up throughout this ancestral lineage. Evolution of humans over millions of years appears to have been marked by a succession of viral pandemics, maybe similar to COVID-19, that were near close calls. Each one was a very, very close call to total extinction. It was a very near thing that a small breeding population emerged after every major pandemic, viral pandemic, that left a mark in terms of its evolution, of its viral heritage in our genomes. So that's the story. And if you look at the primate evolutionary tree and see where the branching points are, one notices one can identify certain inserts of ERVs and HERVs and so on as they're called precisely at the branching points of this evolving tree of life. So to wrap up, many different lines of evidence. I've not been able to go through all of them for lack of time, but many different lines of evidence now all converge on one grand idea that has to be embraced against all the opposition that we have today. And that grand idea is that life is cosmic. Life is a cosmic phenomenon. And the supporting evidence has come from geology. You can see in this figure from cosmic dust, from genetics, from meteorites, from comets. And I didn't have time to go through this carefully, but also from epidemiology of certain viral diseases like influenza. So that's where we stand at the moment. The dawn of a new paradigm is overdue, in my view, and in the light of all the evidence that I have shown you. Aristotle's spontaneous generation, I think, now should be finally laid to rest, given a grand burial. So if you look at this development, we had a similar picture for the Copernican revolution. If you look at the last 200 odd years of the life from space story, you have from 1800, you have Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s, and Kelvin, Svante Arrhenius I talked about, and then in the mid-19th century, we have Fred Hoyle and myself coming in and so on. And so that's continuing right to the present day, and it's drawing to a conclusion. The evidence is quite clear. There's no doubt that we have to totally discard the current ideas of an Earth-centered origin of life, spontaneous generation, in favor of life being a truly cosmic phenomenon, as was the title of the lecture that I gave at the IFS in 1981. But in the year 2021, there is an alarming tendency or trend to devalue or ignore new results that are culturally inadmissible, and go against the grain of colonized science. And this is done simply with the aim of maintaining colonial preeminence in science, I think is one part of it. And the second part is in extending the lease of life of an ailing geocentric paradigm. There's no doubt that the geocentric life paradigm is in serious danger and has to be thrown out really very, very quickly. So the resistance now that is so strong and the tendency to ignore a whole lot of data that accord with this point of view poses an imminent danger, not just for science, but for the well-being of humanity as a whole. Earth-centered spontaneous generation is a bandwagon, I think. This picture is very funny. It's a bandwagon that is almost close to falling over the cliff, over the edge. I want to end with this quote, which I think is attributed to a novelist, Terry Pratchett. And the quote goes as follows: if you do not know where you come from, then you do not know where you're going to. And if you do not know where you are, then you do not know where you're going. And if you do not know where you're going, you are probably going wrong. Thank you.
He is not online right now, so we cannot invite him for any discussion. But if the audience or anybody wants to make any comments, I think our chairman is online and some of the scientists are online. And if you want to make any comment, you can make, but I can leave for a few minutes. Okay, in absence of any comments, let's thank Prof Chandra Wikramasinghe for his very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure most of you enjoyed it. It's a, as he says, it's a paradigm shift. It's a, he showed the history, how these concepts were developed, and how difficult it is to remove these ancient concepts and take up the new views. So let's thank Professor Chandra Wikramasinghe for his lecture. Thank you everyone for participating. We will see you again in another webinar. Thank you.